You're standing on a frozen plain. It's roughly 170,000 years ago. There's no fabric, no needle, no concept of a wardrobe. There's just you, your bare skin, and a wind that feels like it's trying to peel that skin off your body. And somewhere, at some point, one of your ancestors looked down at a dead animal, looked at its warm, thick hide, and thought, wait, what if I wore that? This is the story of how humans started wearing clothes. Not fashion, not haute couture, not the guy at your office who somehow wears shorts in December to prove a point. We're talking about the very first time a human being wrapped something around their body on purpose, and why that decision might be one of the reasons our species is still here at all. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Clothing didn't start as decoration. It didn't start with cotton or wool or dye or anything you'd recognize as getting dressed. The desire to cover the body might be tangled up with something much bigger. Survival, migration, even the evolution of human skin itself. And the evidence for this is genuinely bizarre, because most of it doesn't come from cloth at all, it comes from lice. Let's start there, because it's the strangest piece of evidence in this entire story. Cloth doesn't survive in the archaeological record. Organic fiber rots, unravels, disappears within decades in most soil conditions. You will never dig up a 170,000-year-old shirt. So how do scientists even begin to date the invention of clothing? In 2003, a team of researchers led by geneticist Mark Stoneking asked a deceptively simple question. Humans have two kinds of lice. Head lice, which live in hair, and body lice, which live in clothing and only visit the skin to feed. Body lice can't survive without fabric to nest in. No clothes, no body lice. It's that simple. So the researchers compared the DNA of head lice and body lice to figure out when the two species split apart. If body lice needed clothing to exist, then the moment they evolved as a distinct species should roughly match the moment humans started wearing something regularly enough for lice to move in permanently. The answer came back at approximately 170,000 years ago, give or take a wide margin of error. Some later studies pushed the estimate closer to 83,000 to 170,000 years. Either way, we're talking about a genetic clock hidden inside a parasite, quietly recording the birth of clothing millennia before anyone thought to write anything down. Think about that for a second. We didn't find the world's first jacket. We found it by asking bugs. Now, here's where we have to be careful about timelines, because clothing and the ability to make clothing are two very different questions. Knowing roughly when humans started wearing something is not the same as knowing what that something was or how they made it. Let's talk about tools, because tools tell a slightly different story, and it's one written in stone rather than DNA. Archaeologists have found hide scrapers, stone tools specifically shaped for cleaning fat and flesh off animal skins, dating back over 300,000 years, associated with both early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. These tools are common at sites across Africa and Europe. They tell us that ancient humans were processing hides long before they were tailoring them into anything resembling clothes. Processing a hide and wearing it as a cape is one level of sophistication. It requires fire to help cure the skin, some understanding of how to scrape and stretch it, and the patience to let it dry without it going stiff as a board. This is technology, but it's simple technology. Drape a treated hide over your shoulders, tie it with a strip of sinew, and you're done. No stitching required. But sewn, tailored clothing, the kind that actually fits your body, with sleeves and layers, is a completely different achievement. And for that, we need needles. The oldest known sewing needles come from a startling range of places. A bone needle with a deliberately drilled eye was found at Denisova Cave in Siberia, dating to around 50,000 years ago, associated with Denisovans, a now extinct cousin species of ours. In China, the Shaogushan site has produced bone needles dated to roughly 30,000 to 40,000 years ago. Across Europe, needle fragments from the Upper Paleolithic period, roughly 25,000 to 40,000 years old, show up at sites associated with early modern humans. A needle changes everything. A needle means you're not just wrapping a hide around your shoulders and hoping it stays put. You're piecing together multiple layers. You're fitting clothing to the shape of a human body. You're creating something closer to a coat than a blanket. And this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because it turns out different groups of ancient humans were not equally good at this. Anthropologist Ian Gilligan has spent years studying the archaeological record of Ice Age clothing, and his research points to something remarkable. Neanderthals, who lived in cold European climates for hundreds of thousands of years, appear to have relied almost entirely on simple draped hides. Scrapers, yes. Needles, essentially no. Homo sapiens, arriving later into the same freezing landscapes, brought something Neanderthals apparently never fully developed: tailored, fitted, layered clothing sewn with eyed needles. Let that sink in. Two different human species lived through the same brutal Ice Age winters. One of them figured out how to make what is essentially a fitted parka. The other one was still wrapping itself in a glorified blanket. This is not a small detail. Some researchers, including Gilligan, have proposed that this gap in clothing technology might have been one of the quiet, unglamorous factors that helped modern humans outcompete Neanderthals as both species pushed into colder and colder environments during the last Ice Age. Nobody won that competition with a spear. Some of it may have been won with a needle and thread. Fitted clothing isn't just warmer. It traps air more efficiently. It doesn't gap and let cold wind sneak in, and it allows for layering, wearing multiple thinner garments instead of one heavy hide, which is more adaptable to changing temperatures throughout the day. In an environment where losing body heat could kill you within hours, that difference in design was not a luxury. It was survival infrastructure. Let's go back even further, though, because there's a piece of this story that connects clothing to something even more fundamental: the human body itself. Modern humans are, compared to almost every other primate, remarkably hairless. Our closest living relatives are covered in thick body hair. We are not. And this isn't a random quirk. Researchers generally agree that humans lost most of their body hair somewhere between 1 and 3 million years ago, likely as an adaptation for a very specific problem: overheating. Early hominins living on the hot African savanna needed an efficient way to dump excess body heat while running, hunting, and moving long distances under direct sun. Losing thick fur and gaining millions of sweat glands solved that problem beautifully. Sweat evaporates off bare skin far more efficiently than it does through fur. But that solution created a brand new problem the moment our ancestors started migrating out of Africa into colder climates, which genetic and archaeological evidence suggests began happening in earnest around 100,000 to 70,000 years ago, with some earlier dispersals even before that. A species that had spent over 1 million years evolving to shed heat now found itself walking into landscapes that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. And unlike wolves or bears, we couldn't simply grow our fur back on an evolutionary timescale that would help the individuals actually making that journey. Evolution is patient. Migration is not. So clothing wasn't just a convenience for early humans expanding into new territory. It was, in a very real sense, a technological replacement for the fur we'd lost. We didn't evolve a new coat. We invented one, and the timing lines up in an almost eerie way with that 170,000-year lice estimate, right around the window when modern humans were beginning to push beyond Africa's warmer regions and needed a solution that biology alone wasn't going to provide fast enough. There's a phrase some anthropologists use for this: cultural evolution outpacing biological evolution. Instead of waiting hundreds of thousands of years for fur to regrow, humans solved the problem in a single generation, and then passed that solution down. A hide, a scraper, eventually a needle. Knowledge instead of genes. That shift, doing culturally in years what evolution would take millennia to do, might be one of the most important turning points in our entire species' story. And clothing may be one of its earliest and most literal examples. Now, let's talk about something that rarely comes up in this conversation: clothing as identity. Because once humans had the ability to cover themselves reliably, something interesting happened. Covering the body stopped being purely functional almost immediately. Archaeological sites across the Upper Paleolithic, roughly 40,000 to 20,000 years ago, contain not just needles and scrapers, but perforated shells, beads, dyed fibers, and ochre residue found directly on garment remnants and burial clothing. At sites like Sungir in Russia, dating to around 34,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered burials where the deceased were dressed in elaborately beaded clothing, thousands of ivory beads sewn in patterns suggesting hoods, shirts, and trousers. Thousands. Each bead individually carved and drilled by hand. That is not the work of someone solving a survival problem. That is the work of a community investing enormous time and skill into how a person's body was presented, even in death. This tells us something important. Clothing crossed a threshold very early in its history, from keeping me alive to showing who I am. Status, group identity, ritual significance, even something resembling early fashion. All of this appears remarkably early in the archaeological record, almost as soon as the technology to produce fitted clothing existed at all. Red ochre, a natural iron oxide pigment, shows up again and again at ancient sites associated with clothing and body decoration, some contexts dating back over 100,000 years. Some researchers argue this pigment use, layered onto hides and skin alike, represents some of the earliest evidence of symbolic thought in our species. The idea that a human being looked at a plain animal hide and thought, "This needs color," is, frankly, one of the most human moments buried in the archaeological record. So by the time clothing became something that regularly survives in graves and cave paintings, it was already doing double duty, keeping bodies warm and telling other humans something about the person wearing it. Those two functions, protection and communication, have never really separated since. Here's where we arrive at an uncomfortable, or at least a humbling, part of the story. For all our modern obsession with fashion, fast clothing, seasonal trends, and closets stuffed with garments we wear twice, the underlying technology hasn't fundamentally changed in tens of thousands of years. We still take a flexible material, cut it, and stitch pieces together to fit the shape of a human body. The needle Denisovans carved from bone 50,000 years ago, and the sewing machine humming in a modern garment factory are doing conceptually the same job, just at wildly different speeds and scales. What has changed is the relationship between clothing and survival. For nearly the entire span of human history, making clothing was slow, skilled, resource-intensive work. A single set of Ice Age winter garments could represent dozens, even hundreds, of hours of hide preparation and sewing. Clothing was valuable. It was inherited, repaired, passed down. Losing your coat in a harsh winter could genuinely threaten your life. Compare that to now, where a piece of clothing can be manufactured, shipped, worn a handful of times, and discarded, all within a single season. The industrial garment economy of the last 2 centuries has done to clothing something similar to what industrial tobacco did to smoking. Taken something that was once scarce, skilled, and meaningful, and turned it into something disposable, engineered for volume rather than value. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend next to a Denisovan carving a single needle by candlelight, or an Ice Age family spending an entire winter season stitching one coat that had to last. There's another thread in this story that almost never gets mentioned, and it's hiding in our feet. In 2005, researcher Eric Trinkhaus, studying skeletal remains from sites across Europe and Asia, noticed something odd about the toe bones of humans from roughly 40,000 years ago onward. Compared to earlier hominins, these later humans had noticeably more gracile, or slender, toe bones, especially the smaller toes. Trinkhaus proposed a striking explanation. This shift coincided with the invention of supportive footwear. Barefoot walking on rough terrain requires strong, robust toes for grip and balance. But once humans started wearing shoes, even simple wrapped hide moccasins, the foot no longer needed to do as much of that gripping work itself. The shoe did it instead. Over generations, the skeleton quietly adapted to a world where the ground was no longer met directly by skin. That means footwear may be one of the only pieces of clothing technology we can actually trace inside the human body itself. Not through a tool we made, but through a shape our own bones changed into because of a tool we made. It's a small, strange kind of proof. The shoe left no plastic wrapper or receipt behind, but it left a fingerprint in the skeleton. And footwear mattered enormously for the same reason fitted clothing did. Frostbite doesn't care how tough you think you are. Exposed feet in freezing conditions fail fast, and a hunter-gatherer with damaged feet is a hunter-gatherer who can no longer hunt, gather, or outrun anything that wants to eat him. Something as unglamorous as wrapped animal hide around your feet may have been, quite literally, one of the differences between a functioning band of survivors and a group slowly losing its ability to move. Put fitted torso clothing, sewn footwear, and processed hides together, and you get something bigger than the sum of its parts, a full-body cold-weather survival kit, invented piece by piece over tens of thousands of years, by people who never once wrote down a single instruction for how to make it. It was taught the way most things were taught for most of human history, not in a classroom. Hands guiding hands, in the low light of a fire, showing someone younger exactly where to cut, where to fold, where to stitch. So when did ancient humans start wearing clothes? The honest answer is, we don't know exactly, and we probably never will pin down a precise date. Cloth and hide don't survive the way stone does. What we have instead is a strange, patchwork trail of evidence, a genetic clock hidden inside lice, stone scrapers scattered across 3 continents, needles carved from bone found in ocean apart from each other, beads sewn by the thousands into burial garments, and the quiet biological fact that we are the naked ape who lost its fur and had to build a new one out of ingenuity instead of evolution. What is absolutely clear is that clothing is old, older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than most of the civilizations you learned about in school. It is tangled up with our biology, our migration out of Africa, our competition with other human species, and our earliest attempts to say something about ourselves without saying a word. There's something almost poetic in that. Every time you pull on a jacket against the cold, you are repeating an act that stretches back through an unbroken chain of human beings. The Ice Age hunter tailoring a hide with a bone needle by firelight. The sun gear mourner sewing thousands of beads into a burial garment for someone they loved. The first hairless hominin shivering on an unfamiliar plain and reaching for the skin of an animal instead of waiting for one of their own to grow back. You're not just getting dressed. You're continuing one of the oldest conversations our species has ever had with the cold.